ladies and gentlemen. And for our first session today, we are truly honored and grateful to have Mr. Jonathan Marskell from World Bank joining us in the topic, Trusted Digital Identity for the Digital Age. I've heard that he's ready. Good morning, Mr. Marskell.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. It's excellent. Before we moving on to the first topic, which will be presented by you, could you please letting us know about the weather in the Singapore? We are having flood and heavy rain right now in Bangkok, Thailand. What about the weather there?
In Singapore, it's just as hot and humid with light rain, but otherwise it's quite nice over here.
You sounds excellent. All right. So could you please move on to your session? I've heard that it's very interesting and our audience is ready. Please.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and Sawadee Krap to everyone in Thailand. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the organizers for organizing such an important event and also to thank them for the kind invitation to speak. If we can move to the next slide, please. To briefly introduce my program at the World Bank, I'm sure you're familiar that the World Bank is a multilateral financial institution. We provide financing and technical assistance to developing countries. And my initiative, which is Identification for Development, we're working in nearly 50 countries supporting digital identity systems because we recognize that digital identity is the lifeblood of the digital economy. Just like you do transactions face-to-face, and often you need to prove your identity with an ID card or some other document, from increasingly, and as you can see in countries like in Singapore, for example, where I am now, you can do the same kinds of transactions completely online because of robust, secure digital identity. And so we work across three pillars. One is supporting those countries. I mentioned we're working in nearly 50, including, for example, in Indonesia and the Philippines in the ASEAN region. We publish research, and you can visit our website, and we convene global stakeholders to develop norms, standards, and global public goods. Next slide, please. So it's also important to recognize that when we talk about identification, that every country is at a different stage of maturity. So some countries are really building the foundations to formally recognize and identify their population. Then they link these systems, these ID card systems, to service delivery, and then they move to digital identity. If you press the next slide, please. Now, Thailand is currently transitioning from that second layer to the third layer. Next slide, please. Is it? Yeah, there we go. So Thailand is moving from that second slide to the third slide. And another way to look at it is this. No, you can go back to the slide with the graph. Thank you. So the other way to look at this is this graph, which shows a maturity model. On the vertical axis is the value of the transaction. So, for example, booking an appointment with a hospital or applying for a loan, these are two very different value transactions. Obviously, applying for a loan requires a lot more security and trust. On the bottom, you'll see the number of transactions. And you'll see here at the bottom left that when societies were much smaller, more localized, they use village and local IDs. And in fact, if you look at the history of Thailand, for example, the Tambian, which has been around for a century or so, that served that purpose of local government officials recognizing, and that was used for local purposes. And then as societies and economies grew a bit, they started to introduce national identity systems. So the ID cards were introduced in Thailand around the 40s or 50s, digitized in the early 2000s. But then the challenge is that blue arrow there, moving from the physical IDs to the digital IDs. And if you just simply digitize what you have now, the ID cards that you have now, then that's, as you can see there, it's not going to add much value. And I'll show you why in a second. Can you go to the next slide, please? So really the problem that's been attempted to solve is actually in this cartoon from 1993 in the New York Times. On the internet, no one knows that you are a dog, right? So if you're interacting with the government, they don't know if this is Jonathan Marskell or if it's Lord_East, for example, some random Twitter account with a bot or someone else behind that pseudonym. Next slide, please. So in other words, some of the practices that exist today, not just in Thailand, but in many middle-income economies, which is to get your ID card, to photocopy it, to sign it, or to take a photo of it and send it, to a business, that is not digital identity. Next slide, please. This is digital identity, and this is just an example, and this is actually the digital identity system of Singapore, which is called SingPass. You scan a QR code, whether it's on a website or in an app or in at a physical location, and you verify yourself on the device, and that device communicates with the service provider, and it verifies the identity. It is secured and trust is established through cryptographic technology, for example, and the identity is bound to the person through, for example, the use of biometrics. Next slide, please. So the method, I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with this, but there's something that you are, which is biometrics, and for particularly for personal devices, facial verification, palm verification, these are the more advanced technologies. Then there's something that you know, so for example, a password or a PIN code, and then something that you have, which could be a phone device or a smart card. And it's a combination of these factors that will bring security, and these can still work remotely. You don't need to have a physical interaction. Next slide, please. Now, the next challenge is, what is more important? Who is the customer, or what is the customer? Now, in this case, I'm talking about myself. Simply knowing that I'm Jonathan Marskell it's important, but it's not particularly valuable when you compare it to what I am. So I am Australian. I work for the World Bank. I have a master's degree from the King's College London. So go back, please. And I have an apartment in Sydney. These kinds of data points are very useful for governments and for businesses who are providing services. So it's actually, but in order to establish these facts in a trusted way in a digital environment, you need to link them to Jonathan Marskell, to the client. So in other words, it's not just about identity, it's about identity plus data. Next slide, please. And we've seen this value in, obviously, Singapore and Estonia are standout countries when it comes to digital economies. In Estonia, I'm sure many of you have heard that 99% of government transactions can be done completely online through a web browser or a mobile app. And this is enabled not just by identity, as I mentioned earlier, it's also the digital signatures and the data sharing that happens behind the scenes within the government through what they call the XT data sharing layer. That links the different registries that governments and the private sector have and enables forms to be pre-filled, for facts to be verified, for example. Then there's Singapore, where around 500 service providers offer 1,700 services completely online through SingPass and CorpPass, which is the business ID, and MyInfo, which is the data sharing platform. And you'll see here on the photo on the left, they've even designed that are suitable for visually impaired persons, which highlights the importance of and the opportunities for inclusion. And it's very important to note that in both the Estonian and Singapore cases, both public or government services and private sector services, for example, financial services, these are accessed using the same digital identity system. Next slide, please. So there's different models to do this, and I'm not going to talk in much detail about it, but I'm very happy to answer any questions. There's centralized models, which, for example, is what currently exists in Singapore, which is that there's a single ID system that is used for everything. But part of the challenge might be that some service providers cannot interoperate or integrate with that system. In Singapore, that's not the case, but in other countries where we've seen that there have been challenges. Then there's a federated approach, which is what exists currently with the NDID framework in Thailand, where the citizen can choose their identity provider. Just like we have a Google account, Facebook account, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc., and we can choose one of those when we sign up for a new website or application, the same can exist for digital identity. So the citizen has a menu of options. If they've been onboarded with bank number one, they can use their identity with bank number one to access a service. This can also be linked with other databases to add other data, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier about property, about credit reports, etc. Then the third one is decentralized identity or decentralized wallets. Now, this is the emerging model in a number of contexts. So, for example, the European Union has proposed a regulation on decentralized wallets, which actually the verification is not against an ID system or an ID provider, but against credentials that are uploaded into a citizen's personal wallet. If you go to the next slide, there's a demonstration of the European one. So the European digital wallet proposal, you'll see here on the phone screen, this guy is storing a French EID card, a driving license from Italy, those, etc. They can upload, they can request a virtual or digital copy of these documents, and it can be presented in the form of a QR code on the phone. It can be shared by Bluetooth. It can be shared as an image, and this can be verified again through cryptographic means. And the benefit of this is it promotes more interoperability and portability when the verification is against the credential rather than the issuing system, which you'll see on the far left, right? So this could open, just like we have physical wallets to store our ID card, our credit card, and business cards, etc. The same, there's nothing stopping something similar happening in the digital world. And I think considering the high smartphone usage and adoption in Thailand, the good connectivity that exists, this is a tremendous opportunity for Thailand. For example, with vaccine certificates can be stored there, driving licenses, passport, etc. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that digital identity is the lifeblood of the digital economy, but really it also combines well with other platforms. So in particular, digital payment systems and data sharing systems. It's those three functions that really make up the digital economy by enabling paperless, presenceless, cashless, and data-empowered transactions, and allowing the private sector to build applications and tools on top of this. And this has really been pioneered in Singapore. They have what's called the National Digital Identity Stack. They also have in India, the India Stack. We're working with a number of countries to build what's called a trust stack. And essentially what it is that you combine digital ID, electronic signatures, data sharing, and digital financial services, and you use common standards, open interfaces, or open APIs, and you allow these systems to work together coherently, which unlocks exponential value. And one recommendation I would have for Thailand is to explore a public-private effort to develop a Thailand trust stack. Next slide, please. And then there's the cross-border usage. So I mentioned in ASEAN, the Philippines is rolling out a digital ID system. In Australia, there's the new Trusted Digital Identity Framework. In South Africa, they're doing it. Canada, European Union, Peru. There's an opportunity for Thailand to integrate with the global digital economy to promote trade in digital services, to facilitate trade more broadly by designing a digital identity framework that would be interoperable, would meet international standards, and working with different countries and economic groupings to allow cross-border transactions completely, especially within the COVID context, where travel has been difficult, but hopefully soon that will be addressed. I would love to come back to Bangkok soon. There'll be an opportunity, it will make economic transactions more resilient to shocks like that. Next slide, please. So then I mentioned inclusive and trusted at the start, and really to measure these two variables, the questions are, in terms of inclusion, not just if everyone can get an ID, but if everyone can use it, and can every service provider, including small, medium enterprises, can they integrate with the ID system? Then in terms of trust, does it allow fully end-to-end online transactions like we see in Singapore and Estonia. If it still requires someone to physically go to an office or post or fax a document, then that's not really a fully trusted digital identity system. Is personal data protected? How secure is that data? And importantly, the risks of misuse, how confident is the public that the system will not have, experience function creep, for example. Next slide, please. So in order to encompass these issues, a group of 30 international organizations, including the World Bank, have developed 10 principles for what a good ID system or framework would look like. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk through the 10 principles because they're on the screen. Please feel free to take a screenshot or you can visit the website, but they cut across the pillars of inclusion, design, and governance. And really, if you look at, for example, number 4, which is create a responsive and interoperable platform, that really recognizes that digital identity systems are not an end in themselves. It's actually something on which others, especially the private sector, should be building on. Next slide, please. So to do this, some recommendations. So I also want to recognize that Thailand has excellent foundations. You have a very good, strong national ID system, good connectivity. The prompt pay, electronic payment systems are very strong. So to launch a whole of economy, public-private effort to develop a national digital ID framework that would bring together the different stakeholders and build that trust stack that I mentioned. Look beyond the who are you use cases and pure identity and start to look at what you are. This will really unlock more growth and more opportunities for the private sector. Work towards that digital trust stack for Thailand by combining identity, payments, and data. In fact, identity and payments are really linked already in Thailand, so it's about bringing that data element in. Strengthen the data protection and cybersecurity frameworks. We know that the data protection law is going to come into force very soon, which is very good, but obviously there's a need to stay constantly vigilant against the cybersecurity threats and work towards cross-border interoperability. With Thailand chairing APEC next year, that is a tremendous opportunity for Thailand to continue to show leadership on this agenda. Thank you so much.
That was truly informative. Thank you very much, Mr. Jonathan Marskell, for your fruitful session this morning. We wish you have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you for joining us.